a commission member for more than 18 years. Angela has more than 25 years of experience in ecosystem management. Her training in social and environmental sciences allows her to promote integrally the principles of the ecosystem approach. She worked in the Colombian Geographic Institute and the Ministry of Environment of Colombia for 14 years and is the Environmental Policy Director at Conservation International Colombia since 2009. So we're very grateful for these three wonderful speakers to be with us this morning. And with that introduction, I hand over proceedings to Christina.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you for your kind introduction. It's wonderful to see you. I just want to add one little thing before I start. This is that I was, for 10 years or longer, I was also the lead negotiator for Norway on REDD+. And for that reason, I'm quite familiar with many of the forest-related legal issues. But in the capacity here, it's purely my personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of any government, and that's a good thing, and it's a very liberating place to be. Before I start, I would like to congratulate you, Beatrice and Ricardo, to this fantastic edition of Resale. And my congratulation goes into, of course, also to Haro for yet another high quality, high level, high relevance edition of Resale. I'm sitting on the board of editors of the journal, and I'm so proud of the amazing work that Haro does with wonderful editors like you, Beatrice and Ricardo. Now, the topic was relevant in 2019, and it is relevant still, and it could not be more timely and more relevant than currently, and unfortunately it probably is going to continue for quite some time. I don't know if you probably have, perhaps because you're watching this field, but perhaps you realize that right after the COP was finished, Brazil announced its newest numbers for deforestation, and between June or July 2020 and July 2021, 13,000 square kilometers were deforested. These were fairly new numbers. They were not announced prior to the COP, but right afterwards. And it should give us an indication of how important it is to shed light on what's happening with the Amazon, not only in Brazil, as you rightly said, but in the entire biome. And for that reason, I just congratulate you to making this effort, but also for working for a long time on this issue of protecting the Amazon. We all know why forests are important. They're important for their climate services. That's not something that is new in terms of sequestering carbon in their biomass, in their soil. But also losing forests doesn't mean that we also lose, or that we only lose the sequestration potential, but it also contributes, of course, to overall CO2 emissions. And as Haro already alluded to, forests have so many other additional values and important functions for biodiversity. Most of the terrestrial biodiversity is found in forests. They're home to many species, more than we know, and probably more than we ever will know, because we're losing them at the rate that doesn't even allow us to explore what is there before it's lost. But they're also providing livelihoods and life and lifestyle and culture to many peoples around the world, to many indigenous groups, but also local communities that live from and live in forests. Now, they are unfortunately also an important resource in terms of timber, in terms of space for other purposes like agricultural purposes, cattle farming or planting of soil plantations and so forth. And they're under threat from fragmentation through road building or other developments. And it is particular with regard to forests that we see all these different functions and objectives really colliding with each other. They're like a laboratory of different confrontational interests. And that's why the law is so important to come in here in order to help us to set priorities and weigh interests that are otherwise confrontational and conflict. Now, the title for my talk is quite a mixed bag of different things. I had to check it when I saw the program, and I will briefly try to address all three of these elements. One is what is currently going on in international law. The other one is dealing with the IUCN resolution, and the third one is to say a little bit about the COP and where forests came in there. But I'm sure you followed this all closely. Let's start perhaps with COP26 and with the climate treaties in general. As you know, and we see several contributions, we do have REDD+ squarely anchored in the Paris Agreement in Article 5.2. This is not news. And REDD+ has received this very prominent position in the Paris Agreement because it means different things to different countries. If you ever wondered why it is in a separate article, I can tell you everything about it. But it was because to many, it is a mitigation measure to address greenhouse gas emissions. To others, it's a development tool. To third others, again, it was a finance tool. And therefore, because it didn't fit anywhere, it ended up in an individual article, at least in the second paragraph of that individual article. And REDD is alive. REDD is alive. Many forest countries have included REDD+ activities in their NDCs, and they keep on doing that. And we see also proposals being put forward to the GCF that are squarely based on the Warsaw Framework for REDD that is included in Article 5.2. Now, as you know, there was a whole discussion about anchoring REDD+ in Article 6 in the context of carbon markets in Glasgow. And it was a very interesting decision or discussion, because the question was whether to explicitly refer to REDD+ in the context of Article 6.2, which are bilateral or bi-regional or tri-regional approaches, or not. And for many parties, every party actually believes that REDD+ is part and parcel of Article 6.2, and it does not need any specific explicit mentioning. There were some parties, very few, that did want to mention REDD+, but for other purposes. The intention behind it was really to fast track and shortcut the reporting requirements and review requirements under Article 6 by including a specific reference and its MRV mechanisms, but that's a different effect. But it is a generally shared understanding that REDD+ and forest initiatives, forest projects in different ways are included in the scope of carbon markets. And as we now know, they will be going forward, and it will be in a very important space to watch for lawyers, because what we do not yet have are social and environmental safeguards. And we know this from REDD+. We know how difficult it can be, because forests house people. We cannot accept that forests are being cut down to be replaced by plantations. But if no appropriate social and environmental safeguards are put in place, there's a high risk that this could actually happen. This is something that came out of the decisions on Article 6.2, but also 6.4, where environmental and social safeguards will have to be developed over the next couple of years. And I can only encourage everyone to follow this space, because it's going to be really important to make sure that these safeguards are meaningful, that they're effective, and that they're being complied with. Other elements on forests, and including the Amazon, of course, is the Forest Declaration that came out of the sidelines of the COP, not the formal negotiations. There was a lot of discussion of see how this is going to be implemented, being just a political declaration as it is, but also within the formal decisions. I think there's some progress that we've seen from the willingness by parties to actually refer to the need to protect and restore forests, in particular in the cover decisions, the first decision by the COP and by the CMA. And for those of you, and I guess you all have seen that language, but there is very interesting, there are very interesting formulations now included in the cover decisions, and I right now put them away and I can find them, where the parties emphasize the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems ecosystems, including to achieve the long-term goal of Convention and the Paris Agreement by acting as sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases and protecting biodiversity, which is really interesting that both of these aspects are being seen in an integrated manner, but while ensuring environmental and social safeguards. And I think this is, again, playing into the same direction that forests are important, but not without proper safeguards. And that is reiterated in the cover decisions. And again, that's a place for lawyers to watch. Now, from there, moving on to another important international negotiations, which will have relevance for forests, and that are the negotiations for the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is supposed to be adopted next year in Kunming in China at the second part of COP15 of the CBD. We do know that the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is supposed to succeed the Aichi targets, which were adopted more than 10 years ago, and mostly were not achieved. Now, with setting new targets, parties again come together and hopefully set themselves new guidelines, which will have to be achieved until 2030, given the dire situation of biodiversity loss and nature destructions. Here in Target 3, for example, in the current negotiation draft, we see the target included to protect and conserve 30% of ecosystems by 2030 through protected areas. That's a tool we already know quite well, but also through other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, which is something that we don't know quite yet so well what it is. But this target is important and will have relevance for forests. And since biodiversity is squarely mentioned in the decision from the climate COP, it also will play in this context of what parties actually agree to under the CBD. The legal aspect here is actually very important to keep an eye on. The global post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will be adopted, hopefully, as a COP decision, and as such is not going to be legally binding, although it's going to be a very important signal. But what makes it legally relevant is that parties' national biodiversity strategy and action plans, which will have to reflect those new targets, are legal obligations under the convention, under the CBD. So parties will have to put forward their next NB sub, as this thing is mentioned or called under the CBD, and will have to include those new targets and report on them. And this makes these new targets linked and drawn into the legally binding structure of the convention. I think this is also something that lawyers may want to follow up and keep an eye on, of how this is actually being done by states in the follow-up of the hopefully successful adoption of the framework in Kunming next year. Now, let me wrap up with the IUCN resolution that was adopted in Marseille in September this year. I don't know if you're all familiar with the IUCN. Of course, we have some very prominent members of the IUCN present, but maybe not everyone has been in the IUCN world before. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, it's an international organization. And interestingly, it has both states as members and non-governmental organizations. It's quite unique in the international landscape. And this huge group of both states and international organizations adopt resolutions, usually every 4th year. And it's a very interesting and intriguing negotiation process when states and NGOs negotiate something together. And this also happened mainly online in Marseille, which added yet another element of complication, but they were able to adopt a large number of resolutions. Now, of course, these resolutions are not legally binding, as resolutions usually are, but they're an important signal for the political landscape that is about to evolve. Usually they pave the way for further developments that we see somewhere. And here the resolution that is maybe of most relevance to this audience and to this topic is resolution 129 on avoiding the point of no return in the Amazon by protecting it by 80% by 2025. This, of course, is a very high bar, and it would be terrific if it was achieved. And we probably all see that it's perhaps not going this way despite all the efforts put into it. But the willingness put out there in a resolution is still a very important signal to push ambition, to push states to do more to protect their forests. If you have a look at the resolution, it was put forward and includes a very strong indigenous focus. There were indigenous groups that were proponents of the or co-proponents of the resolution, of the initial motion. And it has very, very important recognition of the role of forests, of the Amazon, for indigenous peoples, for their rights, but also for their plight and for their challenges and needs and damages that are being faced in terms of being environmental defenders and persecuted for that, or just losing their lands and their access to their forests. It is interesting what the resolution actually does, because it does call on area-based conservation targets to protect 80% by 2025. And again, this could be an important input into the CBD negotiations. At least it gives an indication of a particular measure that could help at least consolidating the 30 by 30 target in the context of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, or even including or increasing it and pushing it upwards. There's also a recognition of the working with indigenous peoples, including them in decision-making, including them effectively in every governance structure that has to do with protecting the Amazon, so as to raise their voice and visibility and importance in decisions that are being made by governments and sub-governments when it comes to affecting the Amazon. And third, there are efforts called upon to restore degraded parts of the forest. It's not just about protecting what we have, but also bringing back what's lost to the extent that this is possible. Interestingly enough, the resolution also mentions ecocide. It mentions that some of the most severe destruction of the Amazon with regard to impacts on indigenous peoples could amount to ecocide or another international crime. And this links back to yet another discussion with which I would like to round up, and maybe something that is open to discussion, is the newly proposed definition of ecocide that was launched earlier this year by a panel of international lawyers that put forward the definition of ecocide as severe environmental harm that is widespread or long-term, and it's either caused by lawful or wanton activities. And the idea behind this, or the objective, is of course to extend or amend the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to include the most severe environmental crimes, environmental destruction, as a fifth international crime to be persecuted by the International Court of Justice. This is yet another discussion to come. We will have to see if it's going to be picked up by states or not, but these are all initiatives that point in the same direction, and we can only work from our respective vantage points as scholars, as lawyers, as judges, maybe, to use the law, to use the tools that we have at our disposal to put it effectively into that global fight to protect the forests that we have. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Christina. And thanks very much for an appropriately widely scoped talk, but again, you brought it to the key focus that we all need to have. So our second speaker is Dr. Erica Baringo, and I'm happy to hand proceedings over to you.
Thank you very much, Brennan. I'm going to share my screen. I hope it works, because it never works when we do this. So I cannot see many of you right now. So can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yeah, yes, we can. Yeah, we can see
cool.
We can see your slides very well.
Perfect. That's great. So, so I'm not a lawyer. I'm a natural scientist. So I cannot talk for 10 minutes without slides and without showing tons of graphs. I really try to cut on my graphs, but it's my school of thought. I need graphs to be able to think. So I apologize in advance. So normally when we think about the Amazon, we think about this. Oh, my slides are not passing. Hold on. I cannot. I'm stuck. Hold on 1 second. Where am I? Oh, it passed. Okay. So normally when we think about the Amazon, we think about this luxuriant green wilderness, this vast forest, or we think about places like this that have been widely deforested. But in 2019, different images got into our screen. Images like this one of fires in the Amazon. And this made to the news worldwide. In 2019, I was in Ethiopia watching fires in the Amazon at some point. So it was very broad, the impacts of those fires. But there's one really important point here, which is that not all fires are the same. We have different fires in the Amazon. I'm going to break down through this figure in the rest of my talk, so you don't need to comprehend it. But basically, there's different types of fires. There's 6 different types of fires. I'm going to talk about 4, which are within this red box. And this is from a paper we published in 2019. And why it's important to understand that there are different types of fires. Because different types of fires have different causes and therefore different consequences and require different public policies to be addressed. The first type of, and one thing that I forgot and is really crucial here is that there's no such thing as natural fires in the Amazon. All fires in the Amazon need to be started by humans. And this is crucial, especially for people that are based in Australia right now, or people in California, or people even here in the Mediterranean forest. They're like, oh, but forests burn. Yes, some forests have evolved with fire, not the Amazon. Fires in the Amazon must be started by humans. And this is crucial to understand. The first type of fires are deforestation fires. How does deforestation happen in the Amazon? Bulldozers bring down the forest, literally bulldoze down the forest, and you have piles of trees resting on the land for weeks to months to come. So they become drier as they are drying under the sun, under the wind, and once they are dry enough, they are set on fire. So all those trees that were chopped months before are going to become ashes and smoke. So the land is clear, be planted for pastures. And it has different drivers, deforestation, like weak governments, like, for example, no law enforcement and global commodities prices. When we have an increase in the price of beef, it tends to be accompanied by an increase in deforestation in the Amazon, or even land speculation. There's also pasture fires. Pasture fires are something that is quite difficult sometimes to explain for people here in Europe, because pastures here are so green and so perfect. In the Amazon, it's not quite like that. Pasture management tends to be very inefficient. And within a few years, start to see lots of little trees growing in the middle of the pasture. And this decreases the carrying capacity of a pasture. What this actually means is that it has less food for the cows. So you need to have less cows because there's less food. But this is not profitable, right? You are decreasing your profit. So what you do is that you burn the pasture, get rid of the vegetation that was invading the pasture, and replant the grass. So those are pasture fires. We also have subsistence agriculture fires. They are done by smallholders. I don't know if you can see, probably you cannot see my mouse, but it's this small plot here that has been burned, a small landholder plot that has been burned. And that's what it used to be called slash and burn agriculture. A small part of the forest is chopped down, burned, planted with manioc. It lasts for a few years, the soil becomes very poor, it doesn't sustain the manioc anymore, and then the family moves to another plot of land of similar size nearby, and that initial plot that was with manioc before, it starts to grow. The forest starts to grow, which we call fallow. So the land is left under fallow, which is this area here on the left of the photo that you can see that is a lighter green. That's an area that has about 5 years, has been abandoned, and now you can see the corn plantation behind this guy's house here. And on the right, you can see manioc plantation. So there's this rotation of subsistence agriculture. But deforestation fires, pasture fires, and subsistence agriculture fires can escape their designated area and get inside the forest, becoming forest fires. Now, the Amazon is far too humid, and the fires normally don't sustain themselves. They die pretty quickly. However, because of climate change, and when we have extreme climate events like big drought, fires are able to sustain themselves and burn the forest. But what did we see in the news in 2019? What type of fires were those? Well, they were deforestation fires. Actually, what we were having in 2019 was not a fire crisis, was a deforestation crisis. Fires are just part of the deforestation process. And here comes my first graph as a good natural scientist. The x-axis, you have years. The bars are numbers of fires. The dark gray means fires in the month of August. The light gray, fires in the months from January to July. The paper was in September, so we don't have the other months. That's the reason why. You might pick up on that. And the taller the bar, the more fires you see in a year. And the bars with the star are bars in years of extreme drought, because we tend to see more fires because fires can sustain themselves for longer in years of extreme drought. And the yellow line is the deforestation rate according to the Brazilian Space Agency. And you can see this match. When there's more deforestation, the line increases. We have more fires. When there's less deforestation, there's less fires, unless it's years of extreme drought, the ones with the stars, where we see a decoupling of this process. But let's look at 2019. This red line here is marking August 2019. That's the amount of fires that we have in August 2019. And this helps us to see how different August 2019 was from previous year for the whole previous decade. The last time that we see so many fires in August was 2010, which was a year of an extreme drought. But also, the last time that we see as much deforestation in 2019 as we saw in 2019 was 2008. 2019 was the first time since 2008 that we passed the barrier of 10,000 square kilometers being deforested in a single year. It was the first time in a decade. So basically, again, the more deforestation, the more fires, and that's exactly what we're seeing in 2019. But how about the future? What does this mean? And especially because Cristina now just talked about the latest project figures showing 13,000 square kilometers being deforested this year. We saw an increase year on year since the new administration took office. What does this mean for the future? Well, the future is already here. We are seeing an Amazon that has increased in temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius, and also that is becoming drier. 2/3 of the basin is going to become drier to the end of the century. So it's a drier and a hotter basin with more deforestation. And therefore, we have chances of more fires escaping into protected areas like these here that are in light green, private properties, which are the ones in dark green, or even indigenous lands, which are in pink in these images of these Landsat images. This is from 2005 to 15. It was a huge drought, a very strong El Nino in the Amazon, was the second strongest El Nino in history. And this is an image from the Tapajós, from the the lower Tapajós. And it represents just 1% of the Amazon basin in this region that I'm showing, with 1 million hectares burned during that year, 1 million hectares of forest that burned during that year of extreme drought. Because remember, fires, when they escape, they can sustain themselves if it's very dry. And what this meant was that we did a study that we followed several areas after that fire, and we saw that tree mortality remained above expected levels for 2.5 years after those fires. Not immediate, all the effect. And actually, those fires in that one region that I showed you, that is representative of many other regions across the Amazon, killed 2.5 billion trees in that tiny area that is just 1% of the Amazon. But when trees die, what is the problem for the climate? It's because all the carbon that was stored in the trunks is emitted through decomposition back to the atmosphere, accelerating climate change. I'm going to break down this figure. If you look at the dashed line on top, that's the emissions result of those 2.5 billion trees that I just said. That's the dashed line. That's 500 teragrams of CO2. It's more than Italy or Austria emits in a year. It's of global relevance, all the CO2 that was emitted due to fires in the Amazon. And remember, it's forest fires that I'm talking about. And the purple bar represents the average, the mean carbon CO2 emissions related to deforestation every year across the whole Brazilian Amazon. So basically, in that 1% of the Amazon basin, we saw, because of the drought of 2015 and the subsequent fires, we saw more CO2 emissions than the annual deforestation emissions that we see in the Amazon. And you might say, well, the forests recover. If you look just at the 10 million hectares of secondary forests, which are the ones growing in areas that have been completely deforested before, they would have to grow between 3 to 8 years constantly without any disturbance to sequester all the CO2 that was emitted because of the fires and the drought in that 1% of the Amazon. Or the 330 million hectares of forest, of primary forest, would have to grow for 1 year to sequester all the CO2. So we're talking about the global relevance and how difficult it is to recover. And in this last paper that I'm showing, if you look inside the red circle, we are gonna see how forests that burned 30 years ago, how they still store 25% less carbon than forests that never burned. What I'm trying to say is forests not necessarily recover after they burn. In terms of avoiding a point of no return, there's 2 points of no return here, really. One is the one that the Amazon, due to increased deforestation and climate change, cannot recycle its own rain, because most of the rainfall that falls within the basin comes from the basin itself, and the forest will collapse, will stop being a rainforest. But it's a different point of no return as well, which is the one that you see inside this photo. This photo is in a protected area, and it's a forest that has been burned more than once. And now it's locked into a different state. It's locked in a state that is an open canopy forest. It has much less biomass, much less carbon. Biodiversity has really changed. And the recovery, we just don't know how long it's gonna take, if ever. So what we must do right now, the most important thing that we can do, especially after seeing the last deforestation figures, is to decrease deforestation, because we are avoiding type 1 point of no return, but we also are avoiding fires, deforestation fires that will escape and cause type 2 point of no return, which is the one that we see in this photo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erica. You explained with great clarity what is a very complex issue. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that during Q&A. And now I'll hand over to our third speaker for this session. Angela, please, over to you.
Thank you, Brendan. And Beatriz, did you receive my presentation? Or?
Sorry, Angela, I have it here. Would you like me to?
Yeah, I prefer, because I'm not good with sharing.
Sure, so I'll do that for you, Angela, no problem.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So, well, I'm also coming from let's say the science world. I am anthropologist myself, and I spent many years working in the Amazon. I have also postgraduate courses and Master of Science in Geography and Landscape Ecology. So based on this, I think I've been working in different parts of the Colombian Amazon, and I started working as an archaeologist when I finished my studies. So it's amazing to see for how many years we have people living in the Amazon in a sustainable manner. And so I wanted to start just highlighting that in Colombia, not only the ecological integrity of the Amazon is in danger, but rather the presence of an impressive cultural heritage represented by archaeological evidence of cultures that inhabited the Amazon for the last 5,000 years. You can see here in the middle what is called the Sistine Chapel of the Amazon, where we have more than 70,000 drawings made by indigenous people, and they are dated back to 5,000 years ago or more. And they are part of the Cherrywike National Park, that is one of the newest and largest national parks that we have in Colombia. And we also have group of more than 150,000 indigenous people that are that speak more than 50 languages. Some of them are currently spoken by less than 500 people, and there are some that are almost extinct because they are spoken by very few people. So, and these cultures have accumulated an impressive amount of knowledge and sustainable management practices of different ecosystem types that make up our Amazon. The next one, please. So as we know, and it has been widely documented by different researchers, we are close or possible to the tipping points in many areas of the Amazon. The Amazon biome is a mosaic of different types of landscapes, and which are interconnected. And countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, they represent a territory that is in some cases known as the Upper Amazon. And these are the territories that connect the Andes with the Amazon. And the clue to understand the ecology of the Amazon is really to integrate the functional, terrestrial, and aquatic components across multiple biophysical gradients, which are more evident in this country. So the whole area of especially Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, they bring not only the cultural connection with the Amazon, but also the ecological and functional connection that is extremely important, because for many people, the Amazon is just Brazil, but the Upper Amazon is extremely important. Then, so you see the existing deforestation rates that we have in the Amazon in general, and the area that I will explain this a little bit more later, what's happening exactly in Colombia. So the next one, please. The next one, Beatriz.
I'll see.
I don't know if you can, okay. Yeah. So at regional scale, the Amazon River presents many levels of connectivity. We have lateral, longitudinal, vertical, and temporal connectivity. And also, well, the temporal one is very important because the Amazon is not really, let's say, important for the amount of carbon that it stores, but also the water flows that are connecting the Andes with the Amazon. And many ecosystem services depend on the productivity of the lowland areas of the Andes, where sediments are carried by the rivers and deposited on the floodplains of the Amazon River and all the tributaries. And the fisheries also depend on these sediments. And it's important to highlight that they played a key role in the development of different cultures since the last 5,000 years. So from an ecological perspective, the forest cover not only fulfills the function of storing carbon, but also creating what we call the flying rivers, that are air flows of water that travel like clouds more than 3,000 kilometers away, thanks to the winds and the conservation of the humid forest mass, releasing more than 20,000 million of metric tons of water in the form of rain that goes to the Atlantic. And well, on the right, you see the current situation of the forest carbon flux in the Amazon and the potential flux that are behind this. The next one, please. So what is happening in the Colombian Amazon? So recently we finalized the ecosystem assessment of the Colombia, the red list assessment of the Colombian ecosystems. And if you look at this, well, the status of the Colombian Amazon is quite good in the sense that it's less concerned. And we happen to have at this point, if you see the map, most of the territory is quite well conserved. We have a significant territory that is under the protection of the indigenous people. We have more than 26 million hectares in indigenous reservations. We also have national and regional protected areas covering a similar extension. So I would say that half or more, about the 60% of the Amazon is protected under national parks and also the indigenous reservations, and the remaining territory are national forestry reserves. But the situation is changing quite a lot during the last years. So the next one, please. So, and if you see from the legal perspective, the legal status of the lands in the Colombian Amazon, as I mentioned before, most of the territory is under a figure of conservation or protection. Only on the west, if you see the areas that are highlighted in on the western part, I don't know if you see my indication, but it's on the western part. These are areas that have been subtracted from the forest reserves and have been colonized, and there are some, let's say, the colonization process that started during the last century, around the 70s or something like that. But as I mentioned, the situation nowadays is changing very fast. So the next one, please. So the deforestation rates during the last years are very much associated with the signature of the peace process with the guerrillas. So we got a highest peak in 2017. And because in that moment, most of these guerrilla groups, they left the territory and then new people came in. And so in that year, almost 1 million hectares were deforested. And currently the deforestation rates have been reduced in about 35%, but still is a big issue for the sustainability of the Amazon. You can see here in this graph that this is the moment where we had the highest peak, and now is again, yeah, it's being reduced, but still it's a big issue, and I will highlight the main concerns and problems that are behind this. The next one, please. So let's look at the main drivers of deforestation and ecosystem degradation in the Colombian Amazon. So this information has been widely discussed in Colombia, and it comes from the National Institute of Environmental Studies. So the main driver is clearing land for pastures and land grabbing, and the figures that we have is between 60 to 100,000 hectares per year. And the main use for these areas, as was indicated before by Erica, is the establishment of pastures and grazing systems that are very unproductive, but is in fact what happened during the last years since 2017 is that there is 1 million of additional heads of cattle in our Amazon. And of course, this is very much connected to the infrastructure development. And in some cases, it's a big contradiction of the policies, because some of them are promoted by the government, by the regional authorities, but also there are some roads that are illegal, completely illegal, and since the period in which the FARC and other groups were in the Amazon. So the extensive cattle farming is a big problem, and also the illicit crop cultivation that's mainly referred to coca plantations, and the illegal logging and illegal mining as well. The next one, please. So here we can see what we call the arc of deforestation in the Northwest Colombian Amazon. And this is the area that I mentioned at the beginning, where we have the Cherrywike National Park. That is an area that is unbelievable how beautiful and how impressive it is from all points of view, archaeological, and also the variety of landscapes that we have in that area. But there, you see here all these red and yellow areas that are deforestation process in national parks, and that is growing due to, well, illegal forces that are very difficult to control. The high demand for beef in many countries of the world. And so all this beef goes through Venezuela or through other countries to the Middle East, to Europe, to China. And this is something that is not under control. And the appropriation of these lands is something that is really complicated, because in some cases they use illegal groups and that are, that they are like the guerrillas, that they arrive with all kinds of guns and equipment to control the lands. So it's something that goes beyond any planning or legal activity. The next one. So there are some important policies and legal decisions that are really useful, and the government is taking advantage of all these instruments to really guarantee the integrity of the Amazon. So first, we have the Colombian Constitution adopted in 1991 that recognizes the rights of indigenous people, and there are also several paragraphs that are important regarding the conservation of nature. After that, we got in 2018 a decision of the Supreme Court of Justice that recognizes the Amazon as a subject of rights, and requests the government to develop an action plan to halt deforestation and develop an intergenerational pact for life in the Amazon. And that required the updating of the land use plans of 5 key municipalities that are located in some of these key areas. Recently, and this is connected with this decision of the Supreme Court, the government adopted an environmental crimes law in middle of this year that penalizes deforestation and controls the illegal appropriation of forest lands and deforestation determinants. I think that that's incredible, but because it's one of the very few countries that has such a kind of law that is really penalizing deforestation. And 2 years ago, and it's also connected with this situation and what also Erica presented on forest fires, there was a pact that was signed in Leticia in 2019 to fight deforestation in 7 Amazon countries to address forest fires and control deforestation. And all countries are committed with that. And the president has been very much interested in really moving this pact forward. And so I think that that's something important for the region. And another commitment that is quite important is the zero deforestation that is included in the Colombian NDC. Well, in my personal view, 230 is too far, but still it's the commitment of the government, assuming that this deforestation process can be really addressed and reduced. And there have been some partnerships signed recently with the government of Norway, UK, US, especially making sure that the supply chain is really sustainable, and especially regarding the beef production and the transformation of land for crops like oil palm or other crops that are really well, are becoming an issue in our territory. The next one. Yeah, so the last, and to wrap up, some of the main priority actions that we see that are required to protect the integrity of the Amazon is, the first is something like what was agreed in Glasgow, that is to conserve, sustainable, manage, and restore key areas, including fluvial and old growth forest reserves for at least 40 million hectares, and guarantee this connectivity with the mountain ecosystems. To ensure the permanence of indigenous communities and their cultures, to strengthen land use planning at local level, including cadastre and all the legal land registration. That is also important, because that will avoid all this appropriation of lands. The promotion of sustainable use practices, including community forestry, the traceability of supply chains, especially livestock, oil palm, and forest products. That I think this is one of the most important things, because it's the only way to stop really the presence of livestock and beef production. To restrict non-sustainable legal extractive activities and the appropriation of lands. So currently there are about 102 exploration blocks for mining and oil, and that would be really a big issue in the future if it's not controlled. For illegal activities and control displacement and land invasion, that is what is happening. The improvement of governance at local level, supporting and empowering indigenous communities, indigenous people and local communities, and last but not least, to promote knowledge-based policies and effective civil society participation. The next one. And I wanted to finish with this one, because it's the promotion of a vision of the Amazon in which trees represent abundance of life and life. And this is a drawing from an indigenous person from the Amazon, and it's the perception that they have of what really a tree means. So it's a different vision from what is happening now. It's a vision of abundance, and so I think this is what we have to keep in mind, the way we look at the trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. That was a wonderful presentation, and it was great to hear of actually the progress being made in Colombia regarding the protection of the Colombian Amazon and that extraordinary Supreme Court decision.
Yes.
Anyway, we now have our Q&A session. So there are two ways you can ask a question. You can raise your virtual hand using the icon in the reactions option, or you can pop a question in the chat box. And I can't see all the participants at once. So if someone has a hand up and I can't see it, let me know, Beatrice.
No problem, Brendan.
While we're waiting for questions, I've got one for Christina, and that's regarding, I think it is Article 38 in the Glasgow COP, the one you referred to at the end, about which emphasises the importance of protecting forests and other ecosystems for mitigation, and that's the first time that language has been used. Previously it's been conservation, and conservation encompasses a wide range of activities, including sustainable use and restoration and ex situ conservation, etc. But forest protection is really quite specific. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about what good work could be done in the context of the Amazon with an article, such an explicit article, or such explicit language within the Glasgow Climate Pact regarding forest protection.
That's a really good question. Well, first of all, the Glasgow Climate Pact are two different decisions. It couldn't be more confusing. but it is a decision under the COP and a decision under the CMA, which is the governing body for the Paris Agreement. Now, under the COP, it is paragraph 21, and under the CMA, it's paragraph 38. They're exactly the same formulations, but one is with regard to the Paris Agreement and one is with regard to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. As I said, it couldn't be more complex. But the question is what to do with it. Now we've got this language, parties agreed, at least in the context of a decision of the COP, the CMA, to emphasize this importance, what can be done with it. And there are different ways. One is that I think it is possible to establish a work stream under either the Paris Agreement or both, to work further on what this actually means. And I would think if a party or some parties would push, that would be established under subsidiary bodies, either for implementation or both, that there could be a continue. Right now, we only have this very general language. And in this context, the IUCN could play an important role because they're an admitted observer. They have been very, very influential in saving this language and putting this language in there and ensuring that it doesn't fall out. We've worked very closely together with Angela and other IUCN members in Glasgow and with parties that it stays. So that's one aspect, that it could evolve into a continuous work program where parties actually have to focus on what it means to protect, conserve, and restore nature and ecosystems, including forests. This is absolutely novel, innovative language under the climate regime. As you rightly say, Brendan, we've never had anything like this. There was a small recognition from Madrid, but it was a far cry from what we have now in these new two decisions. And another element is, what can it already do in the context of national legal system? Can it already influence decision makers? And of course it can, but it needs push, it needs pressure, it needs interest groups that point decision makers to what the government has actually kind of committed to or subscribed to internationally, and translate this into national actions, international policies, plans, and eventually perhaps legal changes. But it is a guiding element that we've got from that international level, and it can be traced down or pushed down or drawn down to the national or even subnational level. But it needs committed people, activists, lawyers, maybe also some politician, parliament, members of parliament, that actually see that connection and work on it. But it is also possible, for example, for judges to use it. Judges have been very creative recently, and Angela referred to the decision of the Supreme Court of Colombia, which is a very interesting one, giving the legal standing to the Amazon, to the Colombian Amazon, and many other things in that decision in the Justicia against the government of Colombia. So judges could actually use this international guidance in interpreting national laws, and they have done this many times before. They just have to be alluded to what is out there, and it's not easy to follow all these developments. But if they were here with us and would read this language, maybe some of them would think, yeah, maybe that's something we can use in the interpretation and application of our domestic laws. So I just encourage you to keep on working on that and the judges to what states actually have signed up to international.
Thank you, Christine. So we have 3 questions. The first is from Paul Martin, and then there's one from Tim Stevens and one from Judith Preston. So Paul, please, over to you.
So you're getting a flood of Australians on the questions.
That's just
anyway,
fine.
It's better than a drought of Australians, perhaps.
I guess. So this is a concern or an issue, and I invite anyone to respond. We've looked closely, along with our Brazilian colleagues, at the implementation of the Biodiversity Convention. And one of the things that's happened by accident is that as we've moved towards metrics like the Aichi targets and other metrics, and people are now treating the SDGs as if they were Biodiversity Convention metrics, we have almost totally lost sight of the governance structure and behaviour commitments, the legal commitments in the Biodiversity Convention. So if you look at the national reports, implementation reports, the fifth and in some cases their sixth reports, and you compare them to, say, their first and second reports, it's really obvious. Countries that wish to, I'll call it cheat, self-select quantifiable targets, then self-report on that implementation. Now with Aichi, there is some background in terms of available metrics, and there is no longer any real accountability or interrogation of their implementation of the very specific commitments of the CBD. I think it's a serious problem, and I think we're being sold, in Australian term, we're being sold a pup. We're being convinced that measurement of outcomes allows us to believe that implementation of governance commitments is happening. And I don't think it is happening in many countries. So I'd invite comment or suggestion about that issue.
Paul? Yeah.
Do you allow me to respond to that, Brendan?
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, and hello. I think this is a really, really important point that you're raising, because the reporting obligations are real legally binding obligations under Article 26 of the CBD. So parties have to report. But as you said, you know, they do it in ways and means that aren't particularly strict, and nobody is really following what's putting forward and what's putting out there. And actually, the negotiations of the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a moment in time where this could be strengthened and enhanced. There's now in the current draft, there are indicators for reporting, if adopted, would guide the reporting quality of parties along the indicators against which they would have to report. But it is kind of flying under the radar because a lot of focus is on the new targets, but how they're going to be implemented and how they're going to be linked to the existing legal obligations, for example, on reporting, to strengthen them and to make sure that parties do not just put forward any kinds of reports, but reports that are real measures of what they're doing, is a really crucial element. And we have a chance right now, because the draft is there, it's the first draft, is being negotiated, to be critical and to be demanding of increasing the correctness and robustness of reporting under the CBD. So thank you very much for raising,
Just one
raising
point.
this.
Maybe this is something where IUCN, particularly the legal arms of IUCN, should be kind of active now.
And we are. I mean, Angela is there, and we are working together in this effort. But I'll give the floor to Angela. I see you raised your hand.
No, I wanted to comment before the question specifically to IUCN, that I think that one of the main concerns that we have in our country, and that we have seen also in the region, is that all these Aichi targets are addressed independently and not so they are not connected. And this is very important, because at the end, you cannot address the targets in isolation. No, everything is connected. But the main point, and this is very much discussed by the government, is the need to really address the drivers of ecosystem degradation, deforestation, and all the topics that we highlighted here. And especially, we are in our government looking for highlighting the relevance of sustainable patterns of production and consumption. I presented the case of the Amazon, and it's sad to see that only just because people are willing to eat beef twice a week, 3 times per week, whatever, we are deforesting the Amazon. I think this is unbelievable, no? So I think that the full change is plenty of problems because they are not sustainable, no? And then you feed in some cases the cows with products coming from the other Cerrado or other ecosystems in the Amazon that are producing food for animals and things like that. So I think that if we don't address that, the sustainable patterns of production and also consumption, I think we won't do anything. And the new framework will be the same thing. We can amend certain topics in our commission, for example, and with the special contribution of the group of the Red List of Ecosystems that is under the leadership of David Kidd and Emily Nicholson from Australia. We are claiming to include really an ecosystem component that is lacking. It's because everything is focused on a species, or and then you jump to something else. But if you don't really keep the integrity of the ecosystems, you are not doing anything. So we are looking for that. In Colombia, that language is also being proposed for the negotiations. We really need to address that level of integration. But I'm more concerned with the drivers. So if we don't do that, the next period will be quite similar to what we have now.
Thanks, Angela. And thanks for that question, Paul. So we probably have time for 2 more questions. There's one from Tim Stevens to Erica, which is about, I guess, short-term projections for fire weather conditions for 2020, and will La Nina mean fewer and less intense fires? And which category of fire, I guess, is the first question to ask.
Thank you, Tim, for the question. And actually, that's a discussion that I was having 2 days ago, because 2022 has another spice on the mix, which is election year. So presidential election year. And normally what we see in Brazil is that in election year, deforestation rates go up. So we would expect fire rates to go up, right? On top of that, 2021 saw less fires than expected. So despite the skyrocketing rates of deforestation, the 13,000 square kilometers that are lost, we didn't see as much fire activity as we expected. It kept on the same level as 2020, when we had 2,000 square kilometers less being deforested. So basically, we have a lot of forest on the ground that has not been burned yet. And this year on Amazon's weather, the Brazilian Amazon, I'm going to correct that, Angela, good point. The Amazon is not all Brazil. The Brazilian Amazon was wetter than it should be. That's one of the reasons why we saw less fire activity this year. So combining a lot of forest that is downed but hasn't been burned, and election year, we could expect to see more fires. That's what I would say if we had a different government in place. But with Bolsonaro, things become quite unpredictable. And as the Amazon is such a sore topic, it was during the deforestation crisis or fire crisis of 2019 was the hashtag, the second most common hashtag in Brazilian history across Twitter on trending topics, just after when Lula was incarcerated. So that they beat even the impeachment of Dilma. So massive political and events didn't get as much attention as the Amazon fires. And research has shown that actually it's a topic that goes across the political spectrum, with not only from the far left all the way to the right, not the far right, but the right, condemning the fires. So maybe there will be a political movement to suppress the fires to have a better image for the campaign trail. Maybe. It's a wild guess because a wild government, I cannot really say, but expecting that it was a normal government in previous years, what we're used to, I would say that we're going to see more fires, that we have all this down forest that hasn't burned due to lying in this year, and also because of the election campaign. So I would say more fires, but Bolsonaro. So
Okay, thanks, Erica. Interesting intersection of ecology and politics. So, and let me know when we're running out of time, Beatrice. because I haven't been tracking it for this Q&A session. There's a question from Judith Preston in the chat box to everyone. To what extent have Indigenous environmental and human rights defenders been able to enforce constitutional provisions in Brazil to protect their biocultural rights, such as Articles 129, 215 and 231?
I don't know anything from Brazil, but I can tell you that in Colombia, if you see the figures, we are the top. We are on the top of the number of environmental defenders that are killed every year. And many come from the Amazon. So I think that this is one of the most serious things that are happening, because these are either indigenous people or local communities that are defending the Amazon and other forests in the country. And well, this is a big issue, at least in Colombia, that we are really concerned about this, because yeah, and everything is connected, because the main issue is, as I mentioned, is the appropriation of the lands. No, so all these people are quite vulnerable.
Beatrice, perhaps you can give a partial answer to that question in terms of the work with the Kaipo and the constitutional rights they have, or the rights under the Constitution which they've used to give them the authority to defend their land, because that's a very good case study.
Thank you, Brandon. So very quickly, I think the situation is similar to what happens in Colombia in reality in terms of the vulnerability of environmental defenders. But we have in Brazil a whole chapter that is dedicated to protection of indigenous rights. So they have ownership of over their lands. They can exploit natural resources. They can have economic activities in those lands that are in line with their traditions and needs as well. This is all on paper. Things in reality are different. So, for example, using the example of the Kayapó, what they have been doing is to very actively go and try to safeguard their lands. So, for example, they created guard posts in key entry points of their territory, in rivers, close to highways. So they are monitoring what is happening. And we have seen a notable reduction of some illegal activities, such as illegal fishing, for example. And in the current state of affairs in Brazil, this has been one of the main, this activity, the guard posts, has been a main barrier to further incursions into Kayapó lands. So this is just an example of what these communities are doing to protect the landing practice. So we see that happening in Brazil, for example.
I think just to add to that, that the rights they have under the Brazilian Constitution give them the power to actually apprehend illegal trespassers and the like. We have another question from Sonia Jose. Are Indigenous communities consulted and their opinions on sustainable consumption of the Amazon rainforest factored into the scope of these reports? Perhaps, Angela, you can talk about the situation in Colombia there. To what extent are Indigenous communities involved in, I guess, the decisions that are made about their territories?
Well, I would say that not too much, not as should be, but in fact, recently, for example, the pre-COP of the CBD took place in the Amazon. I was there with the government, and it was in a place in one of these malocas at the heart of the Colombian Amazon. So it was quite interesting to see the way the indigenous communities got involved in the process and got really interested in this discussion. I think for the very first time we had a meeting that was broadcasted all over the world from one of these malocas in the Amazon. But in general, the communities are not really let's say, yeah, involved in these decisions. Always they are well nice.
Well, that brings wonderful presentations. I know we all learned a great deal from it, and thank you for your questions. And we're now going to have a 5-minute break, a health break, a quick health break.
Sorry, Professor Mackey.
Yes.
We have another question from Dr. Garcia. I'm sure we are running out of time, but her question to the speakers is, what are their views about the outcomes of COP26 regarding forests?
Well, I think we've decided that we have to end this session because we've run over time. So time, general questions, which I'm sure we'll get to during the course of the next discussions. So I'll end this session now. We'll have a 5-minute break. Please come back for the next roundtable discussion, which will be chaired by Tim. So thanks very much again, and see you all in 5 minutes.
Hi, Tim, are you there? You
Yes,
have the-
I'm here.
Yes, we
Hey,
are.
Beatrice, how you going?
Very good. I see the very beautiful background of Sydney University.
It is indeed. Yes, it's jacaranda blossoming
Yes,
season.
yes. It's so beautiful, and these amazing buildings.
And of course, the blossoming of the jacaranda at the University of Sydney is associated with panic by students that they've left their study too late. When the jacarandas are blossoming, it means it's too late to start studying for your exams and you're going to be in trouble. Shall I begin, or should we wait for a few more people?
Okay, so we need to have here a team. Justine,
We have Justine, yeah.
Maria Antonia, Ricardo is here, and Joanna is here as well. And Delton is here. I think we are fine to start, Tim. I think everybody's
Very
here.
good. Okay. Well, look, I'll do so. So, hello everyone, whether you're in Bogota or Brisbane, all over the world. It was a great privilege to be invited to contribute to this special issue, and I think it's a tremendous special issue. And kudos to our wonderful editors who are with us, and to the editor-in-chief for making it happen. And thanks also for the invitation to join this webinar, which has been a real eye-opener. I think that the first session was really really interesting in delving deeply into the trouble that the Amazon is in. Now, mindful of the time, I propose that we roll the two roundtable discussions into one. I think that also makes sense because one of our discussants, Maria Augusta Paim, in the second roundtable is not able to join us. So I think we'll roll them all in together, both of them together. And what I suggest we do, and I'm mindful here of really Erica's presentation, perhaps more than anyone's, which highlighted the absolute imperative that we stop deforestation, across the Amazon biome. I mean, that is the absolute imperative. That is the priority. And all contributors to the special issue have in various ways engaged with the question about how we achieve that. So in the way that I want this discussion to run, or propose the discussion to run, I'd like each of the contributors who are here to engage with that. To what extent does their area of research and inquiry help contribute to that overall objective, because that's the objective which we need to achieve. So with that in mind, can I turn first to Justine Bendel from the University of Exeter. And Justine and I worked on our contribution to the special issue. And I'd like to ask you, Justine, in our paper, we looked at various regimes that could be used internationally to bring deforestation under control in the Amazon. From your perspective, which do you think is most promising?
Hi everyone. First, thanks for having me here. To everyone again, it's a great pleasure to share this webinar with you. It has been so interesting, as Tim has said, and as to answer the question that Tim has asked about what is the most promising sort of litigation path for effective deforestation. We looked at the various interstate claims and also a human rights and investment regime. And our conclusion was that probably the human rights regime was the one that could bring about change the fastest, for two reasons. One was it was not dependent on other states to be interested enough, despite the relaxing rules on standing for interstate litigation. So it was not so much of a procedural concern, more of a political concern. But also the fact that in the human rights context, there may be less of a need to focus on transboundary harm or transboundary effects, and that having the potential for domestic intervention could bring about faster change. So I think I can leave it at this for now.
Thank you, Justine. Yes, that was, I think, right on point. So then moving from the international to the domestic, and specifically in Brazil, which remains, I guess, the main focus of attention because of the size of the Amazon in Brazil and the historic issues and contemporary issues around the failure of governance there, really. So I'd like now to ask Joanna Setzer and Delton Winter de Cavallo, who I think are both with us. I'm not sure who wants to take this question. Joanna's from the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE, and Delton is from the Universidad do Vale do Rio dos Sinos. Joanna or Delton, looking internally in Brazil, what strategies are being used in terms of climate litigation as a way of curbing illegal deforestation?
Hi, good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you for this opportunity to share a bit what we discussed in this paper. And just wanted to say it has been a really very wonderful experience to be part of this special issue. So thanks and congratulations to the editors, and yeah, and thanks for inviting us to speak tonight. So very briefly, I think it's important to make a few points, and hopefully this will give you a sense of what we have discussed in our paper. So the first point I wanted to make is that you could think that our paper is about climate litigation to combat deforestation in the Amazon on a first look. So the paper is a little bit about that, but not just about that. And first, I want to say why it is about this type of litigation, and then Delton will talk about why there is more to the paper and the analysis we make. So I think it's important to keep in mind that litigation to fight illegal deforestation is not new in Brazil, of course. So for many decades, thousands of lawsuits have been filed before Brazilian courts on issues relating to clearing of land and illegal logging. What we started seeing more recently is this new emerging trend of climate litigation that targets the poor enforcement of domestic climate and forestry legislation. This new trend is, of course, part of the wider trend or global movement of climate litigation. And specifically, this type of climate litigation to combat deforestation is also observed in other global South countries, particularly in other South American countries, as it has already been discussed. So what Delton and I do in this paper is that we started by identifying 7 climate lawsuits that were filed between 2019 and 2020. And these lawsuits, they're challenging the inaction and the deregulation of the Bolsonaro administration, directly linking deforestation and climate. So a very small group of lawsuits, 7. Analyzing this small set of cases, the first argument that we make is that this body of cases have some common goals. So you could call this climate litigation to combat deforestation. They try to do that. They also try to reduce Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions. And there's also that objective of bringing climate action or the matter of climate change to Brazilian courts. But then looking at each one of these cases, you realize that they are very distinct. So it's only 7, but one very, very different from the other. And in my 1 minute left, I want to just flesh out some of the distinctions. One is that they are brought by a very diverse set of actors. So you have governments, public prosecutors, national and international NGOs, and even political parties filing these cases, some of them in a combination of actors. Most are filed against the government, but also there is at least one case against a corporation. And now if you look at the different grounds on which they are brought and the legal provisions, you can observe that these cases range from damage claims against the corporation to claims that are addressing specific actions. So from a negative obligation to refrain from activities to positive obligations to adopt or enforce measures. And also, of course, inaction. Some of these, quite a few, rely on human rights. And this is where I stop, and I give the chance for Delton to explain that there's one particular case that we focus on the paper that he is very much involved in that goes a step further. So it's not just about human rights, and you will understand why. So Delton, to you.
Thank you, Joanna. First of all, I would like to thank Beatriz and Ricardo and all the editors, Haro, for this beautiful edition. Actually, this is a hard question about what is unique about the IEA case versus Brazil, because there is a broad set of different and inspiring climate cases around the world, as you all know. But I would say that some features of this case are unique in the Brazilian legal context, at least. First of all, we frame the forest protection within a climate change context, with climate change terminology and concepts based on climate change science, and not as a traditional environmental issue. Second, we sought a court order to enforce the climate targets set out in our own national legislation to combat deforestation and carbon emissions. But third, the most significant innovation of the case is that we sought the recognition of a fundamental right implicitly entrenched in the Constitution, the right to a stable climate for present and future generations, which was presented as a logical consequence of integrating classic fundamental rights expressly foreseen in the Brazilian Constitution. The fundamental right to a stable climate, as described in this case, represents a new implicit constitutional category, resulting from the synergy between fundamental rights and a new generation of global environmental problems. In fact, as an update to the case, we recently had a favorable decision from an appeal court that supports our view of the specificity of climate cases as compared to environmental lawsuits. This was the first time a Brazilian court decided that there is indeed a difference between environmental issues and climate change cases. Even though you might have two cases that address deforestation, the environmental perspective can be more limited both in terms of time and space, while the climate case will tend to focus more on intergenerational and global issues. And that's why we believe it's important to fight for a specific fundamental right to address climate instability. And this is it. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna and Dalton. So now we go from São Leopoldo all the way to Wales, to Cardiff, to Ricardo. And so my question to you, Ricardo, in relation to your paper, is to what extent is it possible, or how can we, through strengthening the protection of Indigenous rights, achieve good environmental outcomes? And are we doing that? Ricardo, sorry, you're on mute still.
My apologies. So I was muted, and thanks so much, team. And it was a great pleasure to work with you and Justine in this special issue, and obviously with all the contributors. So in relation to my paper and the argument that I developed over having a human rights approach to environmental impact assessments, it is the case that most environmental impact assessments and even social impact assessments include an element of public participation, and some of the elements that we are trying to bring in with a more human rights focused approach to environmental impact assessment. But considering the serious impact of these major large-scale infrastructure projects in the Amazon, such as the Belo Monte hydroelectric power dam, that it's one of the case studies in this paper, it's felt that there needs to be additional reassurances. There needs to be an element of guarantees for these local and indigenous communities, which are highly impacted by these major infrastructure projects. They serious, significant. There's a lot of evidence over dislocation and environmental harm caused to these communities. All of these going pretty much against all the international standards related to indigenous people's rights, and indeed the Brazilian legislation, which also prohibits many of these practices. So a human rights approach which strengthen the point in which communications would happen between the project developers and indigenous communities. It would strengthen the process for grievances to be addressed in the case of, in many of these cases, like the Belo Monte, if there was an effective grievances process, they might have found a solution that was not as harmful as it was for the communities. It would and this approach has been advocated by other scholars. Professor Diane Shelton have been advocating this approach for decades, but certainly when it comes to major areas of ecological interest, such as the Amazon, you cannot allow a major infrastructure project such as this going ahead without this so-called social license to operate, without these additional reassurances to the communities that their human rights will be protected. And it is true as well that it doesn't necessarily add a lot to the existing human rights obligations that Brazil is already bound under international law, but certainly this brings in a new dimension, including a more preventative approach in which you try to avoid harm from happening before all the problems that we've seen happening in the case of the Belo Monte. And it's a very clear example that ends up in all the international, pretty much all the international human rights tribunals and compliance committees, and obviously the United Nations Indigenous Special Rapporteurs for Indigenous Peoples also noted all the failures on the participation and consultation. So the argument was developed around that I thought that needed to be a much stronger human rights framework for project impact assessment, and hopefully this argument was made clearly enough or strongly enough.
Thank you, Ricardo. So we only have about 5 minutes or so to go, but I think we can deal with the remaining papers in that time. So now I'll turn to Maria Antonia Tigre. I'm not sure where you're dialing in from, Maria. I just tried to find out with a Google, but it didn't help because you're part of a global network for the study of human rights and the environment, so you could be anywhere. You're the director of Latin America for that global network. And in your very interesting paper, you you look at the impacts of the pandemic in the Amazon, and really the failure to control the pandemic has in fact had negative environmental impacts. It's resulted in increased levels of deforestation. My question to you is, you argue in your paper that common strategies are needed in the Amazon to combat both forest fires and handling present and future pandemics. And you used ASEAN as a model of regional cooperation. What lessons do you think could be learnt from our neck of the woods and the kind of ASEAN Asian area for the Amazon?
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, Ricardo and Beatriz, for organizing this. It's been really a wonderful panel, and I apologize. It's actually very, very noisy here. There are kids running around, like 6 kids running around. So I'm locked in the room and hopefully won't listen to it, but I'm in New York and it's Thanksgiving today, but it's really a pleasure to talk a little bit about this work that's really, really relevant. So the paper that I wrote is really grounded a lot on the regional cooperation between the Amazon countries, and something that I've worked on for many years. And this one talks specifically about the responses to COVID-19 and to indigenous groups, and how that the lack of response at the regional level really led to obviously health impacts on indigenous communities in the Amazon, but also an increased level of deforestation. And I talked a little bit about some of the actions that the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization did. So the Secretariat has really sought to consolidate regional cooperation to support Amazon countries and reduce the coronavirus's spread and population's mortality rate, especially with vulnerable people and indigenous groups. There was a technical cooperation framework agreement that was signed with the Pan American Health Organization program for South America. And it's usually, all of those measures were related to surveillance, environmental health, border health management, and technologies for improving the efficiency and effectiveness of health interventions. But like most of the things that the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization does, it's a lot of data gathering and information sharing, but there weren't really a lot of actual measures that helped deal with that. So the comparison with ASEAN, it's very interesting because the cooperation that ASEAN did was a lot more proactive in a way. So they obviously considering as well that the epicenter of the pandemic really started in Asia, and how that developed, they were probably better prepared. But it's really a model that I think should be followed, because they quickly acted at the onset of the pandemic to provide responses that were grounded in collaboration, with the goal to mitigate the spread of the disease and its impacts on people. So they acknowledge the environmental footing of the disease and its impact on people, and proposed measures to address biodiversity protection, which is really at the core of preventing the future pandemics. And there's certainly a lot of lessons here for Amazonia. There's several papers that talk about how the super rich biodiversity that we have in Amazonia could actually be, if we don't really care for it in the way that we should, it could very well be that the Amazon forest could be the next, the epicenter of the next pandemic. So I think there are definitely several lessons there to try to avoid that, that are related to avoiding deforestation and climate change and biodiversity, and promoting biodiversity protection.
Maria Antonia, thank you very much, and all the best for dealing with all those kids next door during Thanksgiving. It can be a challenge, I know. Now we turn, and I think appropriately, given Beatrice's central role in making today happen and making the special issue happen. So we're now turning to the paper by Beatrice, Lawrence Rimmer, Leticia Canal Vieira, and Brendan Mackey. And I think I don't know whether we've got all of them here, so I don't know who wants to answer this question, but I'll kind of cut to the chase. Their paper was looking at REDD++ Plus and forest protection on indigenous lands in the Amazon. But the question I really want to ask, and I think we all really want the answer to this, is to what extent is REDD making a positive contribution to curbing deforestation in the Amazon? And will it ever do so at sufficient scale to make much of a difference?
All right, so maybe I'll start and then I'll let my colleagues here to help me. So in our paper, we are looking at REDD Plus as a carbon market mechanism. So we looked at 21 REDD Plus projects in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, under the verified carbon standard, now called VERA, and looking at how they are performing. Are they performing well? Are they helping? So I'll let Lawrence talk a little more about the markets, but what we saw is that there have been very low credit sales, and basically these projects were not really providing a steady, reliable source of income for the project proponents, who can be individuals, indigenous communities. So that was the key point for us, that in the current state of affairs, these projects are not really being that successful source of or tool for forest conservation. But I'll probably stop here. I'll let Lawrence maybe talk a little more about the market aspect of that question, Tim, if that's okay.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm calling in from Sydney. It's very wet here. Thank you so far for everyone's contributions to the webinar. Yes, as Beatrice was alluding to, the paper that we were looking at was very much more focused on a market-based mechanism, which is the voluntary market. And that's a big confusion around REDD in general, is that there's actually various mechanisms you can use to implement such a concept. In terms of a voluntary market, again, I'll just flag, I'll answer this question first, not acknowledging the fact that COP26 has just happened. We'll give you another bit of an addition to this question as well, after just acknowledging the COP26 outcome. But looking at the voluntary market that we've seen over the last 10 years, over the last 15 years, there's certain barriers, unfortunately, for communities, specifically indigenous communities, from actually participating in a voluntary mechanism. The first barrier that you will actually see is the barrier to the participation, which is the requirement to actually have upfront investment, upfront skills to actually implement a mechanism such as a REDD Plus project. And that is because of the requirements that we lay out for people to jump through to actually develop a project from scratch. You know, understanding stakeholder engagement, you're going to be having to calculate carbon stocks using GIS software if you can't get into the ground. You've got to understand the complexities around benefit sharing arrangements. And this process in general would take 2 years, being generous, or even longer. If you've jumped through all those hoops, you've got the second barrier, which is the market itself. And unfortunately with this, the voluntary market, is you find that supply far outstrips demand for voluntary carbon credits. Voluntary market means that you're not mandated to actually offset your emissions. You are doing it voluntarily, similar to, say, purchasing a flight. You voluntarily offset your emissions to do so. That's the type of market we're talking about here. If forest credits aren't the only credits that actually are part of this market, there's different ways in which you can generate carbon credits, renewable energy, for example, and you find that actually forest and land use credits are only 37% of the market overall. And despite their high cost of implementation compared to the other activities, you find that they don't actually generate a higher revenue, because essentially a carbon credit is one thing, it's a unit of carbon. And you have to require people to understand that additional investment on biodiversity or the social benefits, and want to commit to that, to actually then acknowledge that as a different product. and therefore pay more. And you do find that forest credits do generate more of an income, but you're still competing against everybody else. And as I say, with that supply outstripping demand, you're competing at a very low bar. And then the last element I would say is certainty. And just because you've implemented a carbon project and that you have got all your documents completed, there's no guarantee that anyone's going to give you carbon credits to sell, because you have to do that continuous demonstration that you are achieving carbon reductions. So we heard earlier about natural disturbances such as fire. We've got illegal activities. All of these are external drivers to deforestation and degradation. And for a community within a specific boundary trying to demonstrate a carbon reduction preventing these, it's almost impossible for them to do, because it's so unpredictable. And they may be offered credits one year, but unfortunately, the next year they may not, due to an external driver. And that unpredictability really then kind of puts in the question is there a more reliable way in which we can deliver forest protection using a carbon mechanism that doesn't disadvantage the people on the ground, the communities on the ground, because currently the market is very much in the hand of the buyer.
Thank you, Lawrence. Do we want, did Letitia or Brendan want to make any observations? Or?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of comments to that. So one of our paper was also written in the context of a case study work we're doing in collaboration with the NGO that has been formed by the Kaiapó Alliance, who have about 10 million hectares of the Brazilian Amazon forest under their constitutional ownership, or it's owned by them, under constitutional powers, and they formed an alliance and of tribes, and formed their own NGO. They employ non-Indigenous Brazilians to run this NGO and help them engage with the world. And in addition to exploring the potential for REDD+ to provide them with some income to help them protect their forests, they also have been using other market mechanisms in terms of a couple of very interesting micro enterprises, Brazilian nuts, which are wild harvested nuts, which they sell and market, and also some ecotourism in the form of sports fishing on the river, of course. And they use these monies to actually fund the guard stations that were referred to earlier, which is actually their main physical tool for forest protection. So they're very committed to protecting their forests, but they need financial resources to do that. They've formed an NGO to help them manage all those relationships. But they have been making good use of microeconomic, micro enterprises to provide some income stream. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. And Letitia there in Bologna, you're happy to sit out that discussion, or no, you want to jump in?
No, I think my co-authors already did a wonderful job. So
okay,
thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Letitia. All right, well, I think that brings us pretty much to the end of the webinar. We may have exhausted time for questions. However, could I just encourage people not to be shy about emailing the wonderful group of collaborators and colleagues we've got on this Zoom if they have any questions they want answering. It's just terrific, some of the international collaboration that comes out of things like this. My work with Justine kind of happened serendipitously. I wouldn't have been part of this special issue without making that contact. So let's keep the conversation going remotely or in person when we're able to do that. So I think it's probably appropriate now that I hand back perhaps to Brendan and Beatrice to bring the webinar to a conclusion.
Thanks, Tim. I'll just make a few summary comments and then I'll hand back to Beatrice to do the final thanks and closure. So again, thanks to everyone for their contributions, both the presentations and the questions and answers. I see on our agenda we had some closure under the title "The Way Forward: How Can Policy and Research Best Support Conservation Efforts in the Amazon?" And we've learned today what a multi and interdisciplinary set of actions are needed. We need to understand the science of the Amazon, the scientific understanding of the Amazon in terms of the climate science and the forest ecology and how land use interacts with all of those. We need to understand about law and governance at multiple levels, international levers and as well as national levers. The political dimension can't be ignored, and the role that an informed and concerned citizenship has in helping to drive domestic policy. And of course, how all of this needs to be done in ways that supports Indigenous rights and social justice and what we're now calling climate justice. So we're all engaged in a very interdisciplinary endeavour, and all our fields of expertise are needed, and I would encourage us all to collaborate going forward. And there's a few avenues by which we can do that. There are some COP decisions which open up some avenues and other courses we should follow. So thank you very much. I've learned a lot from all of you, and let me hand over to Beatrice to close the session.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I would just like to thank once more our fantastic guest speakers. We all learned a lot today. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your time. I would like to thank each of the authors of this special issue for your engagement, for your fantastic work, and it has been such a pleasure to work with you. Thank you, Aho, for making that possible as well, and Ricardo, again. I would like to thank all participants who came today and were here with us. And I also I agree with Tim and Professor Brendan as well. I think we should try to keep working together, as we have very similar areas of research and interest, and it would be a great pleasure to keep that discussion going forward. Thank you very much. I'll let you now go, have dinner, breakfast, go back to your activities. Thank you so very much. Yeah, I'll stay a little longer. If you have any questions or any comments, I'll be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. It was wonderful.
Obrigada.
Obrigada, Joana. Fantástico.
Nice to see you all.
Bye bye.
Obrigada, Ricardo.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Tchau, tchau. Delton, obrigada por sua contribuição. Letícia, finalmente nós nos vemos.